So this is part 3, the organization of the living. Section A, teleology is a regulative principle. Quote, an organized being is then not a mere machine, for that has merely moving power, but it possesses in itself formative power of a self-propagating kind, which it communicates to its materials though they have it not of themselves. It organizes them, in fact, and this cannot be explained by the mere mechanical faculty of motion. End quote. Immanuel Kant from the Critique of Judgment. In the Critique of Judgment, Kant ridicules the very idea of a purely mechanical account of life. Quote, it is quite certain that in terms of merely mechanical principles of nature, we cannot even adequately become familiar with, much less explain, organized beings and how they are internally possible. So certain is this that we may boldly state that it is absurd for human beings even to attempt it, or to hope that perhaps some day another Newton might arise who would explain it to us, in terms of natural laws unordered by any intention, how even a mere blade of grass is produced. End quote. Many materialists have argued that Darwin was exactly the, quote, Newton of the grass blade, end quote, that Kant thought would never come. But this confuses an important distinction between ontogeny and phylogeny. Darwin's theory was exclusively an account of the phylogenic development of species. As Evan Thompson makes clear, quote, Kant's concern was the definite organization of living beings, but the Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection does not provide any account of organization at the level of biological individuals. On the contrary, the theory must presuppose biologically organized individuals that reproduce. End quote. To suppose Darwin's theory banished the imminent purposes of particular beings is to commit Whitehead's fallacy of misplaced concreteness. One mistakes a general law about the abstraction species for an argument about the nature of concrete particulars. Further, because Darwin had to presuppose reproducing organisms for his theory of speciation to work, modern biology cannot look to his work for a complete account of life. Kant's genius was to recognize that, quote, some products of material nature cannot be judged to be possible in terms of merely mechanical laws. To understand life, according to Kant, we must employ teleological causality. Like Paley, Kant also thought artifacts were impossible to explain without some kind of teleological principle. Material and efficient causes were not enough to account for the design of a wheel, for instance. But unlike Paley, Kant understood organisms as natural products, not artifacts of divine design. A natural product is produced by way of a natural purpose, in contrast to an artifact, which is produced by an external intelligent agent. Footnote, Kant's Aristotelianism is evidenced here. Darwin and Paley were more influenced by Plato's dualism between form and matter than Kant. Kant was able to conceive of the purposes of an organism as immanent, thereby avoiding the machine-organism analogy. However, Kant imposed his own dualism, which we will explore below. A natural purpose, to return to the text, is found in, quote, a thing that is both cause and effect of itself, end quote. That's Kant. It will be helpful to explore the relationship between artifacts and organisms a bit further. Both are organized in a purposeful manner, which means they are incomprehensible without an idea motivating their production. Further, the structure of an organized thing, artifact or organism, is such that each of the parts composing it exists for the sake of the whole. Each of the components conforms to an overall idea. But this is not enough to understand the natural purposes of organisms, as Kant explains. Quote, we must think of each part as an organ that produces the other parts, so that each reciprocally produces the other. Only if a product meets that condition will it be both an organized and a self-organizing being, which therefore can be called a natural purpose. Again, an artifact is purposeful because it is caused by an idea, but it is an idea that, quote, resides outside the entity in the mind of an intelligent designer, end quote. The idea of an organism, in contrast, is, quote, both cause and effect of itself, end quote. Kant's coining of and elucidation of the term self-organization is strikingly similar to Varella's theory of autopoiesis, but a subtle and important complication remains for us to discuss before we can move on to this more recent formulation. Kant saw the natural purposes of organisms as merely a regulative principle of our own epistemological limitations. Regulative principles, in contrast to constitutive principles, do not tell us what a thing is, but only what we can know about that thing. Kant held that we needed both mechanical and teleological modes of thought to investigate nature, but was agnostic as to their ultimate relation to things, whether mechanical or organic in form. This is a necessary result of the Kantian dualism between phenomena and noumena. Even so, Kant comes very close to admitting that self-organization is constitutive of living organisms, and not just a regulative principle, but backs away from this position for reasons that are extremely significant considering the aim of our current exploration. It is worth quoting him at length. Quote, "In considering nature and the ability it displays in organized products, we say far too little if we call this an analog of art, for in that case we think of an artist as apart from nature. Rather, nature organizes itself. We might be closer if we call this inscrutable property of nature an analog of life, but in that case we must either endow matter as mere matter with a property, halozoism, that contradicts its nature. Halozoism is the idea that matter is alive in some way, or else we must supplement matter with an alien principle, a soul, conjoined to it. But if an organized product is to be a natural product, then we cannot make this soul the artificer that constructed it, since that would remove the product from corporeal nature. And yet the only alternative would be to say that this soul uses as its instrument organized matter. But if we presuppose organized matter, we do not make it a whit more intelligible. Strictly speaking, therefore, the organization of nature has nothing analogous to any causality known to us." End quote. Here Kant attempts to reconcile the possibility that organisms are intrinsically self-organizing and therefore purposeful with his commitment to Newtonian science. He finds that he must either endow matter with lifelike properties or admit a dualism whereby an intelligent soul either constructs or inhabits organized matter. He rejects both on the grounds that they conflict with Newton's view of nature as composed of inert and unfeeling atoms shuffled around by transcendentally imposed laws. Self-organization, therefore, is seen as an entirely irrational principle that is nonetheless indispensable for our understanding of living creatures. Kant's understanding of the nature and scope of science was lacking due to no fault of his own. In the time since his death, both the study of physics and the study of self-organization in biology have advanced beyond the wildest dreams of the 18th century imagination. Kant, like most of his generation, was mesmerized by the mathematical magic displayed in Newton's Principia. But as Gebser points out, this form of mathematics permits calculation with infinitely small variable quantities. These quantities are merely mathematical quantities, and render causal process is measurable by mathematically fragmenting intensities. These spatialized quantities of intensity will continue to exert a negative effect until we clearly recognize this rational falsification." End quote. Gebser is here attempting to explain that mathematical systems like Newton's are essentially abstractions, basing their measurements of space and time on, quote, so-called ideal quantities, end quote, that are actually falsely spatialized intensities. The significance of this will not become clear until we begin to investigate the process physics, metaphysics of Whitehead, but for now we can allude once more to the tendency of the deficient mental structure of consciousness to spatialize and quantify everything, leading to, quote, an extreme dualistic form of thinking which recognized only two antithetical and irreconcilable constituents of the world: measurable, demonstrable things, the rational components of science, which were valid, and the non-measurable phenomena, the irrational non-components, which were invalid. End quote. Kant falls victim to this extreme form of dualism and so is forced to understand self-organization as merely an appearance necessitated by the structures of our understanding. Life was self-organizing and purposeful, but only because the human mind was unable to describe it in any other way. Part 4.